for that introduction. It's very nice seeing all of you also from this perspective. It's our pleasure and honor to start here with the first session. And for that, I guess my two guests hardly need any introduction, but I still say a few words about that. So on my right here is Paul Healy, who is the James R. Williston Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School in the Accounting and Management Department. And then here on my left is my colleague Gaizka Ormázabal, a Professor of Accounting and Control and holder of the Grupo Santander Chair of Financial Institution and Corporate Governance. My name is Anneloes. I'm a professor here in the Managing People Department and holder of the Poots Chair of Global Leadership Development. So with that, I guess I'm someone for whom, you know, the notion of corporate culture and measuring those type of constructs comes maybe a little bit more naturally, but I'm delighted seeing here the interest from such a diverse perspective in such an important field of study. So with that, I guess I really much look forward. I know already I did get a little bit of a sneak preview in our two presenters for this panel. So Paul, if I may ask you, and I much look forward to hearing your take on the questions around board effectiveness. Thank you for being here.
Thank you all.
No, it's fine.
Oh.
It's probably
okay.
That'll do it.
So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much to Jordi and IESE for inviting me. It's really a privilege to be here. And actually, after being cooped up in Boston for several years, it's wonderful to be able to travel away, leave Boston and come away. Marco sort of, when he talked about culture and Canadians moving to the US and sticking with their metric culture, made me realize that I'm a Kiwi, I'm a New Zealander, and I actually avoided the metric system by moving to the US. So that was my way of keeping my culture. What I'm going to talk about really today is the culture of the board, and I'll start with motivation. GE, this is a Wall Street Journal article on GE. Jordi didn't mention GE, but I think the concerns that were raised about board governance certainly apply to GE. And the piece that I particularly like is the part that I've highlighted in yellow. First of all, the board of GE is kind of a who's who. It's very well-known people. And the comment, this is coming from the Wall Street Journal, for 36 years under Jeff Immelt and Jack Welch, the board had largely followed the chairman's lead. One newcomer under Welch was so surprised by the lack of debate that the director asked a more senior colleague, "What's the role of a GE board member?" And the older replied, "Applause." So what I'm going to try to do today is take a look at the following questions. How do directors perceive both the operational performance, the internal governance of the board, the board dynamics, and then how do they also understand and appreciate the board's effectiveness? We've seen lots of examples of boards maybe doing well, but also examples of board failures. So how do directors themselves perceive these questions? And then second, and this is a more exploratory piece of it, is there any relationship between the two? I mean, you might think that it's pretty obvious that if the board's functioning effectively, the firm will function effectively, and vice versa. I'm not sure about that, but certainly one might think that the board would be an important determinant of the firm's performance. Prior research on this has focused largely on looking at correlations or relationships between firm performance, actual firm performance, or actual board outcomes and board decisions as a function of board characteristics, the composition of the board, the traits of its directors, and so forth. But there have been recognized limitations to that research. First of all, the board characteristics themselves are endogenous, but also I think everyone has recognized that the internal performance of the board, the internal dynamics of the board as kind of a team of individuals that are collectively making decisions is likely to be important, but really hasn't been explored. And the way I'm going to try and do that is with my co-authors, I'm going to conduct a survey. Something, as you mentioned, is rather new to me, but it struck me as the only way to really start to dig into this question, or these questions. So we're going to ask a wide range of questions that are based on prior research and practitioner input. We've tested this survey before we actually implemented it with the sample that we're going to share with you. The data was collected from in 2015 to 2016. There was a 7% response rate. And the survey itself actually covered, it was global. So we had about 2,500 directors that we have responses from. Most of them are outside the US. They're from public and from private boards. So I'm going to focus, though, on results for the US public companies. I'll talk a little bit toward the end about whether those results seem to hold over for other types of boards or in other parts of the world. So in addition to looking at just the survey results, we decided we wanted to collect more qualitative data. And so we did this in two ways. One was in the survey itself, we gave space for respondents to actually provide qualitative answers to questions, just to expand upon their survey results with some qualitative data. Then the other thing we did was for 75 directors, most of whom were actually, in fact, all of whom were respondents to the survey, were willing to give us greater engagement. We actually conducted interviews with them. So we were able to get a lot more qualitative data to justify or to understand better the findings that I'm going to share with you. Well, understandably, there are challenges with surveys. One is that you worry about is that the people that respond to the surveys tend to be maybe a biased sample. That you don't get a random sample of people that respond to the surveys. And we certainly worried about that. I don't pretend that we solved that problem, but if you look at the characteristics of the directors who responded to us versus the characteristics of board directors in general, they look like they're roughly comparable. There are a few differences, but they look roughly comparable. The same is true that if you look at the boards that they're representing, they look comparable to the boards that we were able to compare, if they're public companies, to the population. The second concern is that if you ask people to evaluate their performance, they tend to think they're doing a good job. And we'll call that response bias. And we certainly worried about that. And you'll see examples of that where it looks like the directors that we surveyed give themselves a little pat on the back at times. But I think what's important is to note that there is some variation in the way that they respond. There's some things that they give themselves a good grade on, and there's other areas where there's clearly some unease that you'll see, which I think is informative. The other thing that we tried to do to control for that is we use what's called a marker variable, which is unrelated to their evaluations of the board performance, that helps to try to control for some of this. Imperfect, but at least an attempt to try to do this. And then, of course, the last piece of this is we can't ever resolve the problems of inferring causation. But I think the other piece of it that we really wrestle with is when we look at a survey, what were the rationales or the logic that was underlying what directors were responding to and about? And so we're able to get at that through the qualitative data. So what were the governance metrics that we looked at? So first of all, the effectiveness. If you look at the board governance effectiveness, there are three metrics that we look at, or three overall metrics that we constructed. One is, how effective is the board at managing risks and overseeing the management of risks in the organization? And we looked at a number of questions that were related to that. One was, for example, around compliance. Another was on the board's role in terms of as a steward of the firm's assets. What was the board's role in financial planning? What was the board's role in cybersecurity? What was the board's role in ensuring that there was a good tone at the top? Maybe getting at this question of culture for the company. The second area we looked at was on strategy, guidance, and appraisal. That is, what's the board's role in overseeing strategy at the organization? And we asked about questions more generally. What's the board's relationship with the CEO on strategy, or alignment with the CEO on strategy? What's the board's alignment amongst itself on strategy? And then we looked at more specific questions that were focused on particular types of strategic issues. What was the board's evaluation of its performance on M&A, on innovation, on global growth? And then the third category we looked at in terms of was management evaluation and selection. How does the board rate itself on questions around compensation? You'll hear more of that from Alex later today. How does the board evaluate itself in terms of CEO evaluation or in terms of succession planning? So these are the three areas that we focused on in terms of board governance effectiveness. So you can see here in terms of the specific questions, some of the both patting yourself on the back, the giving yourself an A, and some of the areas where the board was maybe a little bit more sanguine about its performance. So these ratings, when I say 94%, that's the percentage of the respondents who gave themselves either a 4 or a 5 out of a 1 to 5 scale. So it was either above average or excellent in terms of the way that they evaluated themselves. So you can see that they rated themselves very highly as stewards of the firm's assets. They rated themselves very highly in terms of setting the right tone for the company with the CEO, or in terms of being aligned with the CEO or themselves on strategy. But what's interesting is that if you actually start to probe a little bit more deeply on the strategy areas, in M&A and technology and innovation and global expansion, there you see the board being not quite so confident, or the respondents not being quite so confident about how the company is doing. So at the high level, thinking they're doing a pretty good job, but maybe at the more micro level on specific issues, perhaps not quite so confident. The other area that's interesting or noteworthy is on risk management. In terms of cybersecurity, much less confident. Only 31% gave themselves a 4 or 5 on that scale. And in terms of CEO succession planning, also an area where the board was less sure that they were doing a good job. If you look at the overall summary statistics, you see that on risk management was the high. They gave themselves a 69%, gave themselves an above average or an excellent rating, 63% for strategy guidance, and lower on management evaluation and selection. I'll give you at least a flavor. It's hard to do this. Geordie told me I had 20 minutes, so I'm constrained here in terms of trying to summarize a lot of data in 20 minutes, but I'll try to give you a flavor for some of the qualitative results that we learned. So this is just to give you a sense on the risk management piece here. What were the directors that we heard responses from saying about cybersecurity? And you can see that where there were concerns, or where they felt that they were not doing a great job, the board lacked expertise. We don't have the expertise on this issue, and we weren't doing anything particular to try to get it. If you looked at the directors that gave themselves a better grade on cybersecurity, they said, while we may not have the expertise, we're going outside and creating an advisory board of experts that can help us with this. We're appointing a new director who's got expertise. We're hiring a consultant who's coming in and helping with this issue. In terms of ratings on strategy, these are some of the ratings around M&A. The high ratings on M&A. We reserve time to talk about the firm's strategy at every meeting, and that helps us be prepared for reviewing acquisitions. We regularly go through companies that management's interested in and why those companies fit the strategy. Versus the low ratings, management never spent the time we needed to help us understand strategy. As a result, with all the time pressures that arise in acquisitions, when you have to move quickly, the board simply went along with what management recommended. There was no real discussion of whether the deal made sense. In terms of management's evaluation and selection, I talked about two types of low responses. In terms of pay, the CEO reviews and compensation is highly political. The CEO is active in setting compensation, making the directors uncomfortable. Where there were predefined criteria for the variable part of compensation, it wasn't applied, and the answer was simply, yes, it normally is a he, deserves it. And succession planning, low ratings, we just don't talk about it. Uncomfortable, the CEO's in the room, why would we want to talk about that? Another comment, we've got a very powerful CEO and doesn't want us to even discuss the CEO successor issues. So what about the independent variables? And we're going to have 4 metrics that look at internal board operations and governance. So one is we'll call director engagement, and that is questions around, are you prepared for meetings, or are directors on your board prepared for meetings? Are they engaged in meetings? What happens outside meetings? Is there further levels of engagement by the board? Interpersonal relationships. So we think that would be an important factor in the board's discussions. What's the CEO's communication with the board? What's the level of collegiality within the board? These are just some examples. There were more questions than these that we asked. The board meeting management. How effective is the board at actually managing the meetings? Does it have the agendas items that it's interested in? Does it do a good job on time management? Is there independent thinking? Is there open and candid discussions that take place? And then lastly, what I'll call the internal governance of the board. Do you have the right people on the board, the right skills? What do you do for onboarding for new people, new board members? What do you do if you've got a problem director? How do you address that? So those are some of the questions that sort of comprised these 4 internal operations categories that we created. And then we also looked, based on prior research, we asked directors about other important metrics, external influences. Is there an activist shareholder, an activist in the stock? Is there a major shareholder? Who is the major shareholder? What are the characteristics of the board, its independence, the number of people on the board, etc.? What are the characteristics of the particular respondent? And largely, what are the characteristics of the company? What's its size? What's its industry? What's its performance and profitability over the last year? So again, you can see a range of results. Right? So high ratings, the agenda reflects our priorities. The committees work well. My voice is heard on the board. In general, the board meeting's effective. We get candid discussions, etc., etc. Where are there low readings? Time management. Right? Typically, time management, we've got a bunch of things we have to do. We really don't get time to discuss the important issues. We don't really address problematic directors. We're not really that engaged between meetings. We don't really provide enough training for new directors. And we don't really evaluate individual directors. So some examples of where there's some variation here. Again, not surprising that when you ask people to rate themselves, they rate themselves on average highly, but at least you can see that there's some variation here. And again, you look at the average scores, you see, they seem to be doing pretty well, or considering themselves to be doing pretty well, perhaps with the exception of internal governance. So just to give you, again, I'm not going to give this for every item here, but at least some qualitative responses on interpersonal relationships. And high responses. We've got a collegial board environment where directors enjoy working with each other, increasing their willingness to share, learn from each other, and exchange ideas. The CEO lays a groundwork for a relationship with the board by providing transparency about what's really going on in the organization, so the board's got candid and complete information. Low ratings. Too much me and way too little us. The boardroom's a challenging environment, influenced often by big egos, low self-esteem and self-awareness, and politics. We haven't been effective in dealing with a highly aggressive CEO. We put too much trust in the CEO and the management team. So just to give you a flavor for when you ask people about where their concerns are, these are some of the responses that you get. So just to give us be able to calibrate in some sense what a low rating means. Does it mean something that sort of resonates with us? So the last thing we do here is to say, well, is there any relationship between these two things, between these two sets of variables, between the effectiveness variables and the independent variables on the board's internal governance and internal operations? And we're going to include the last, oh, that wasn't what I thought that was. We're going to put the last question here is we're going to put this halo marker to try to control for the overall optimism and bias that you might think in there by saying we're going to include a variable which says, do you enjoy serving on the board? Which is sort of a positive question, but and hopefully picks up any bias that would be reflected in the answers that the directors are giving us. So what do we find? We find, first of all, that it doesn't matter whether you put those board internal operations variables in there one by one or put them all in together or even aggregate them. We find that there's a very positive relationship between each of the three outcome measures, each of the three effectiveness measures in terms of corporate governance, and the internal operations of the board. Just to give you a sense of how significant they are. So if you had a 1 unit increase, remember we used, for most of these questions, we used a 1 to 5 Likert scale. So if you had a 1 unit increase in board meeting management ratings, you would get a 1.1 standard deviation increase in risk management effectiveness. If you did a 1 unit increase in interpersonal relations, you get a 1 standard deviation increase in strategy, guidance, and appraisal. So these effects are at least seem to be both statistically significant, but more important, sort of economically significant. That maybe not surprisingly, that as you improve the governance on the effectiveness of the board's internal operations, that translates into effectiveness of the board as a governing agent for the shareholders. So lastly, some robustness checks. We used a different marker variable. We used, has serving on the board enhanced your professional reputation? We used the individual, because we aggregated the questions. We had many questions. We aggregated them into these categories. We tried using individual survey questions. We used factor analysis to try to figure out what the right groupings of variables were going to be. And the results were basically unchanged. As I said, we also have data for US private companies and non-US public and private companies. And actually the results are remarkably similar, that you see these same effects for both types of firms. Certainly if you're at a family board, there may be some different dynamics that are important, but some of these same parameters seem to come into play in determining whether the board seems to be considering that it's doing a good job of managing itself, and whether it's doing a good job of actually overseeing risk management strategy and the CEO. And then the last thing is, of course, which I readily acknowledge, that we're looking at your evaluations of how you think you're affecting the governance of the firm, and maybe you're wrong, right? So the last thing we did, we did give in the survey, we gave the respondents the opportunity to actually tell us what their company was. We didn't ask them to do it. In fact, we gave them, most of them were anonymous, but we did ask them if they were willing to give us the data on what was the name of the company. We could actually go and corroborate some of the evidence that they gave us. And there was at least, these results are particularly exploratory because the numbers are small and there's strong selection bias, et cetera, but at least we did find that companies which had, and the providers us the names, where they had weak strategy appraisal ratings, were more likely to have goodwill write-offs in the next year, suggesting that they weren't making great acquisitions. If they had particularly poor CEO succession planning ratings, they were more likely to appoint an outsider as in the subsequent year or two as a CEO. And if they rated their CEO evaluation ratings poorly, they had a much lower ratio of stock-based compensation in their ratings, or for their CEO. So in summary, most of the directors rated themselves pretty highly. On risk management oversight was highest, followed by strategy, guidance and appraisal, and then management evaluation and selection. But there were important areas where we noticed that the board wasn't quite as optimistic or positive. Cybersecurity risk management, strategy guidance on technology and the specifics, innovation, global expansion, M&A, succession planning, and evaluation of future management talent. And the same was true in how they rated themselves internally for their own operations. But there were also exceptions there. In particular, they didn't feel confident that they were doing a good job of evaluating individual directors or addressing problematic directors, training new members, so areas of opportunity. And then there was, at least in terms of the relationship between these, there seemed to be a strong correlation between them. So I'm gonna stop there and let Gaizka.
Thank you, Paul.
Have a turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay. All right. So thank you, Paul, for this excellent presentation. So I guess my job here is to provide a little bit of context on Paul's findings. And for those of you that might not be that familiar with academic research, let me show you a little bit, what we have learned from, let's say, academic research in finance and accounting. And this is where Paul is actually coming from. So here you have basically, I would say, the classical questions on this space. Whether the structure of the board determines the quality of the board. The famous one-size-fits-all, who monitors the monitor, regulation, can we fix things with regulation, and research on certain practices. And you have here an overview of the results. I mean, we could talk about, these specific points, but I mean, the point I want to make here is that recommended governance practices do not necessarily have the intended effect. And I think that this is also extensible to other components of the corporate governance system in general. I mean, if we talk about legislation, regulatory oversight, proxy advisors, rating agencies, stock exchanges, stock indexes, the media, politicians. I mean, the literature provides, let's say, settings in which they have a positive effect, but there's also instances where actually the effect is not positive or even negative, right? So this sort of suggests that let's say the external corporate governance system might not be enough. We might need something else, right? So how are things evolving? I think that this is also important to to understand the context. Where are we heading to? I guess we are all familiar with the increase in the percentage of independent directors after SOX, right? And after the financial crisis, actually, you see also a very dramatic increase in the limits of D&O insurance. I mean, suggesting that now directors are assuming a higher risk than before. And I guess we are also aware of, let's say, this tendency in the US of, let's say, going towards a lower number of public companies, which also has implications in terms of corporate governance, because private firms are, let's say, subject to a different level of scrutiny. Okay. The probability of hostile takeover has also evolved over time. Maybe, perhaps it suggests that, let's say, the takeover market is not as a strong governance mechanism as it used to be in the past. And at the same time, we are observing the eruption of index investing, large asset management firms. Here you have data on the big three. The big three meaning the three largest asset management companies. Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street. These might have implications for corporate governance practices. This is from a recent paper I have with co-authors. We look at basically the dispersion of CEO pay over time, and we see that actually there is a dramatic decrease in the dispersion of CEO pay levels, meaning that CEO compensation contracts are getting more and more similar to each other, and we also find that this is actually related to the influence of proxy advisory firms. Other things that I would say are remarkable, these are recent findings by the economic literature. There is a dramatic increase in the average markups. I mean, it seems that this is concentrated in the upper part of the distribution, what is called the superstar firms. And there is also a dramatic decrease in union membership. Okay, so a decrease in the fraction of GDP shared by labor. So I mean, this also probably going to have influence on the corporate governance space. And the climate emergency, right? It looks like we are not going at the pace that we should be going, to meet the net zero objective by 2050, right? And perhaps because of this concern, we are seeing also a dramatic increase in ESG investing. Okay, so here you have data on PRI signatories. I guess, I mean, we're sort of like, we sort of know this, but when you actually look at the magnitudes, and this is what is interesting to collect data, it's actually very eloquent, right? I mean, it sort of suggests that we are definitely moving towards a different equilibrium. Here you have data on the number of ESG labeled funds, right? I mean, ETFs, open-ended funds, right? So, and we have ESG activism. Okay, so here you have the famous case of Engine #1 and Exxon. The interesting thing I would point out here is that these sort of events, activism events, are accompanied by a negative market reaction, suggesting that maybe shareholders are willing to, to assume a cost, to improve sustainability or ESG performance. Okay? But there's also the concern of greenwashing. Okay, here you have some examples of allegations against BlackRock. We have seen, some moves recently in the enforcement space. But there is also evidence at the same time that this activism is actually having some effect. Here's some recent paper that finds a negative association between CO2 emissions and Big Three ownership. And it looks like, I mean, this negative relationship is concentrated in recent years. Okay, so sort of like suggesting that in recent years, we are getting up of speed, right? And this again might also affect governance practices. Here you have, I think, that very eloquent data on the evolution of, let's say, the practice of including ESG metrics in compensation contracts. I mean, it's going up big time, right? So, I mean, what is my takeaway? I mean, I could get going, right? Because we haven't talked about, technological disruption, geopolitics, and I mean, it looks like things are changing a lot. They are changing very rapidly, also in the governance space. So, my takeaway from this: while important, the external corporate governance system has limitations, and in particular, the structural attributes of the board. That means that the internal functioning of the board is going to be crucial, and we need to understand it, right? And the job of directors is becoming increasingly challenging. That means, in my mind, that culture is meant to play a very important role. Okay? But how can we learn about this? That is the problem, right? Because we don't have data on culture and the internal operations of the board, right? So, I mean, it looks like the only way to address this, to approach this, is field research, experiments, surveys, right? And this is what Paul does, okay? But there is a long tradition of, let's say, survey research in corporate governance. Actually, I learned this from Anneloes. She, educated me, in this part of the literature, and I also, I mean, for me, it was kind of like a discovery, right? Because, I mean, they actually tackle very, very interesting issues: internal board dynamics, board relationships to a variety of stakeholders, notably employees, the teamness, right? I mean, the efficiency of teams at the high level, personality characteristics, cognitive biases. I mean, of course, we cannot address this with archival data, with external data, right? So what is, Paul's survey adding to this? I think that to begin with is adding breadth and depth. Okay, so they make a tremendous effort, to contact a very large number of executives out there. Okay, so I guess, this is very powerful, right? And they also are very thorough in terms of depth, like, the sort of issues that they address and they tackle, right? I mean, you can see there all the things that they look at in terms of board effectiveness. I'm not gonna expand on this because he has already described the findings, right? In terms of, let's say, internal board operations. I mean, this is a very ambitious exercise, right? And I think that the findings are also very, very interesting and very telling, right? I mean, to the best of my knowledge, this association between internal board operations and board effectiveness, even though very important, has not been documented anywhere, right? And what I found especially interesting is actually, to take survey data and correlate it with actual data, external data, right? Like financial performance. I understand that these tests, I mean, you acknowledge that they have a lot of limitations and the results are actually might not be that conclusive, but I think that this is novel and interesting and definitely worth knowing, okay? So how can we improve this? Well, maybe one way, is to see whether there's something missing there, okay? Even though it's very thorough, right? But there could be something missing, something we could complement in the future, right? And maybe one way to think about it is to think about the functions of the board. And I took Jordi Canal's recent book that actually, identifies the 6 functions, or maybe there are more, but he talks about six functions of the board. And actually, Paul's surveys covers a bunch of them, actually, right? We could discuss whether it covers them in deeply enough, but it's definitely there, right? But maybe there are some things that you might consider and that are not in the survey, right? Like, for example, things related to purpose, engagement with shareholders and other key stakeholders. Maybe these are potentially important things that are not covered by the survey and could be something left for future research. In summary, okay, so in summary, the economic context and the corporate governance system are evolving fast in a complex way. Yeah, so therefore, analyzing board structures is not enough. We need more research on the internal functioning of the board. We need to integrate somehow the findings from different research fields. I think that Paul's attempt for that is a very nice one. To provide recommendations for practice and for regulators, right? Now, how to do this? I don't know. I'm not sure how to do this, let's say, in a rigorous way. I think that this is something that maybe we can discuss this. Maybe Paul in the Q&A could provide some insights about this. But there is something, I guess, something that we in academia need to figure out. And to finish, I would say that it would be also very interesting to get the input from practitioners and see what do you want to know that you academics are not, let's say, telling us, are not able to these questions that you have not been able to provide answers for. Okay, that's what I have. Thanks again, Paul. Thanks again, Anneloes, and I'm gonna leave the stage to Anneloes. Back to Anneloes.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very kind of you to say that the stage is mine, but in fact, I think it's yours, right? Because this is the time and the opportunity to see if I have many questions, but obviously, this is the time to see and hear from you. So any questions around what we have discussed? The microphone, yes, I think they're coming from the back already. So if you would just raise your hand, then the microphone will come your way. Yeah, Gillian, yeah.
Well, I guess I'll kick things off, but I'm really excited about one of the 94% thought they were really good at stewarding assets, right? But yet you had a 43% for talent management. And we know one of the charts that you didn't put up that I would have loved to see the trend was the intangible assets of companies being the vast majority of their assets. So was there anything in the interviews that came up where you had maybe more of an intangible driven firm that might have had differential? Because those seem to be inconsistent in my mind, and so I'm trying to understand how maybe boards can handle that better.
I think it's a great question, Gillian, and I would say that it's more about the way that people, when we were talking about assets, they think about the physical assets of the company, like cash and receivables and inventory and plant. They don't think about the intangible assets as much of the company. Maybe they're measured, maybe they're not measured, frequently not measured. But I think that when you look at the specific responses to questions around M&A, which creates intangible assets actually on the books, or technology, or innovation, those are intangible assets really that I think boards probably don't think about them as assets in that way. They think about the strategy side of it. They don't think about that. And when they think about asset stewardship, they're thinking really about tangible assets, I would say. So is there a disconnect? Yes and no. There's a disconnect in the sense that they focus on the tangible side of things. They really probably should be thinking about all of the assets, including those that are not measured.
So yeah, please, Christina.
Thank you so much for your presentations and for the commentaries. So just to push you a little bit more on this question on the intangibles, it seems, and I'm sorry I haven't read the paper, but it seems like your results in terms of the weakness of the board was very much focused on the people as well, right? Like on the evaluation of the directors, the CEO succession, and just to connect it to the panel, it seems to me that that is also related to the culture of the organization in a way. So would you, I know I'm making a big assumption here, but would you, when you interview people, when you interview the directors in your more qualitative work, did you sense some of that? Could you talk about, so in other words, could you talk a little bit on the culture of this organization? Did you sense it somewhere? And related to that, the purpose? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that that the culture of the board, or at least the board's responsibility, is to oversee the culture of the company, unquestionably. I don't think we can make, at least based on the data that we've got, a strong relationship between what the culture of the board is and the culture of the companies. There are a few questions that sort of get into that a little bit, but I don't think I would say that they're deep enough to be able to sort of make that conclusion. But I certainly think that you're right, that the board's responsibility is to actually ensure that there's a well-functioning culture, however you define that, and what role the CEO and the board together play in that is an important piece of what creates the firm's culture.
It's a very interesting survey. So this might be beyond the scope of the survey, but maybe you addressed it in the interview. So you mentioned it's the board's responsibility to control, to oversee the culture. What information does the board have on it? So how does it actually evaluate it? So are they expected to go to make some unscheduled site visits, or is there a particular director who's responsible for it? So what information do they get on something which is quite intangible?
So I think that I did, certainly when in talking with, in qualitative research, talking with boards about how do they get their hands around that question. It's a really good question. And the directors that I talked to who are most articulate about that said that they get it from a multitude of ways. One is frequently they would make their board meetings would take place in different parts of the organization. So they might move around the world. If they do that, they'll get a chance to meet people in different parts of the organization. And they use that as an opportunity to sort of get a sense of the pulse of the culture of the company. So meeting people outside the top management team is one thing that they would try to do. Even if they're within the headquarters, just getting to sort of have dinner with people or meet people off-site. And if there's a sense that they're not given reasonable freedom to access people deeper in the organization, they would see that as a red flag. The other is, which I thought was interesting, was one of the directors in a company that said, we play a pretty important role in an annual survey that an independent organization puts together for all our employees, where part of the questions in the survey relate to the culture of the company. And we have some input into that in terms of, as the board, as to what those questions are going to look like, and we get that data on an annual basis to judge how employees themselves are seeing the culture.
Thanks.
It strikes me that the person who owns board culture more than anybody else is the chairman. And there wasn't an awful lot of discussion about the chairman in your paper. Are there any learnings in relation to where the chairman comes from, how they're appointed, their tenure, their qualifications? Is there anything that we can learn on that?
So you're right. We didn't dig into that particular question. I think that you're right that the chairman plays a critical role. I suspect, since we're on this side of the Atlantic, that you're going to say next that isn't it a problem that most U.S. companies have the chair and the CEO in the same many of them in the same person? And I think that's right. I find that a potential problem. The advantage behind it is that at least the chairman is chair is fairly well acquainted with and intimate with the firm. But I think almost universally, if there were problems, it would come back to the chair. That was a weak, quote unquote, people would say there's a weak chair. That is a chair that doesn't take the position of the board, or make sure that the board's getting the right information, and make sure that the types of issues that were discussed in the survey are getting dealt with in the board. That the chair is seen as a critical player in that. If the chair is the CEO, that may be part of the problem, or it may just be also that the chair isn't particularly effective.
I saw a question here. Solved already? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. For sure, it's a very interesting topic and very relevant for not only for the economical, transcendental financial effects in the companies, it's very important as well for the legal issues. Based on that, probably you didn't ask them, the board, on the legal issues, but I consider it's very important to link this culture board performance with these legal effects. It's very important because sometimes we have a lot of legal issues in the company and we are not linking them with this culture performance, and sometimes even related to innovation, or even with the management in itself. And my question is, did you ask something on that, or even you didn't ask them something on that? Did you realize something on the way that they realize the link with these both topics? Because they are transcendent for the legal issues. Relative, sometimes we are focused on solve some legal points, but the root of these problems are in this managing culture in the company. Thank you.
So I think legal issues affect the board in multiple ways, some of which weren't really discussed in the survey. But I teach in board programs, and I'm certainly very much aware that directors worry about their legal liability. Is that what you're thinking about in this? I think that actually, given as fiduciaries, they clearly have responsibilities, legal responsibilities, but in the US, the business judgment rule gives them quite a lot of scope to exercise that. And I think actually the bigger concern for directors isn't so much their legal liability as their reputational risk. So for me, that would be a bigger issue that I would be worried about as a director. Let me pick it up in a different way, and that is one of the things that did come out of the survey was, especially around risk management, several directors that we spoke to were concerned that as more and more regulatory requirements were placed on the board, that the board ended up becoming more of a check the box, having more of a check the box mentality. And particularly, initially when many of these came from Sarbanes-Oxley. Well, right after Sarbanes-Oxley, the board was very attentive to these issues. But over time, it becomes much more of a repetitive and check the box type approach that the board takes on some of these issues. And I think the concern that several directors raised was that that's not necessarily achieving the purpose that was intended when this legislation was passed. So that's a different take on legal aspects, but it seems to me also relevant.
Paul, do you envision any way to certify externally the quality of the culture of a firm? I mean, or do we want to do that? I mean, is it something that would be helpful for, let's say, external investors, or would generate, let's say, incentives to improve that culture, or we should stay away from that?
So when you say we, are you referring to we as like
we as society,
or we as a society,
we as society,
or we as academics?
We as society, let's put it that way. I mean, like, some sort of, and this might not be a good idea, but, some sort of like rating, external evaluation, because, I mean, basically your data is based on or self-evaluation, right? Yes. And for the reasons that you mentioned, this might not be, let's say, the first measure, right? So, I mean, maybe, some type of external evaluation could help. What type of external evaluation? What could be, let's say, the pros and cons of this, let's say, the potential unintended consequences?
Well, certainly as an academic, I feel like this is kind of like the unanswered question, or one of the unanswered questions. There's probably many unanswered questions, but this is an important one. It seems if you're interested in companies and how they perform, I think culture is important. And the challenge really comes back to how do we try to address it in a rigorous way. And that I'll give some suggestions. One of my colleagues has been working on CEOs, and she has been following CEOs and has collected data on exactly what CEOs do. Well, that seems pretty detailed and descriptive. I don't see why we can't also be doing survey-type research that would focus on how do employees inside a company perceive their culture. I think actually companies ultimately will end up with companies wanting to do that themselves, and if the board thinks it's important to understand the culture, there'll be more pressure to try to do that in large companies. Whether that then gets disclosed, it's an interesting question, right? Should companies, if they do this, should they disclose that information? If you look at Glassdoor and other online databases that provide us with information on how people who are leaving companies are perceiving them, that's also getting in the sense that it's something a little more substantive about culture. So I think if we're creative, we can think about ways of trying to measure culture as an academic. And I think as a company, you should also, there's also opportunities to be trying to measure that variable and try to judge what are the issues in improving one's culture. And because I do, just seems like common sense that the culture of an organization probably has an impact.
Yeah. And perceptions are also important, right? Because perceptions lead to actions and determine behavior.
Yeah.
So that's also important.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's extreme. I mean, that probably concludes the panel on exactly the theme of this conference, right? Corporate culture, how important is it? How can we measure it? How can we, that in OB is always a perspective. What if you start measuring it? How do you make, you talked about your response bias also, but obviously do you want to have this kind of glorified, perfect picture of your culture, whereas maybe the real picture in the end is more interesting. So I think with that, we got a tremendous amount of insights already, but definitely also continuing food for thought for during the break now and then in the rest of the session. So for now, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you so much, Gaizka, and let's go to the coffee break, I think, and then continue. Thank you.